Welcome, traveler. Come closer and sit by the scroll. The wind presses gently on the shutters. You've arrived at just the right hour, when memory softens and old stories rise without force. What lies before us is not urgent, it is patient, a truth written in strokes and pauses. The ink is warm, the scroll remembers, and here you are not expected to speak. Let go of the day, and let your thoughts move like drifting leaves. Let the story you. Let me tell you of a time that still echoes. The Way of Samurai. The wind carries a hush through the pine-covered hills of Kamakura. It is the late 12th century, and the sun, pale and reverent, rests against the tiled rooftops of a quiet warrior town. The capital has shifted, not to the marble halls of emperors, but to the disciplined stillness of the samurai. Here, amid wooden dojos and cragged mountain temples, a new order stirs. The rule of the sword, tempered by the silence of Zen. The scent of cedar and ink hangs in the air. Morning begins with bowed heads and cold water drawn from stone wells. The men who rise wear not silks, but hakama, wide pleated trousers tied at the waist, and over them the weight of duty. These are not just fighters, but followers of Bushido, the way of the warrior. And the way is narrow. Blades are polished before dawn, not out of vanity, but as prayer. Words are few. Actions carry the soul. In the still corners of tea rooms, warriors sit in seiza, backs straight, hands resting quietly on their knees. Their minds, honed like their swords, reflect on impermanence. Mujo, the truth that all things, like the mist on the mountain or the blossom on the branch, must one day fall. Temples rise on distant ridges, carved into rock and spirit alike. Monks chant with low bell-like voices, echoing through bamboo groves. In these places, samurai come not to fight, but to learn how to let go. To die well, they say, one must first learn how to live without clinging. And so the warrior's life is one of contradiction. Strength in stillness, resolve in surrender, death not feared, but met with poise. Even ink and brush become weapons of clarity as they craft their final verses. Jisei no Ku, poems not of despair, but of quiet knowing. This is the world we enter now, a world where honor is worth more than breath, and where, beneath the moon's pale gaze, a man prepares to die not in defeat, but in grace. But it wasn't only on the battlefield that a warrior learned the weight of his blade. There was another place, quieter than war, and far more demanding. The training hall. At first light, when mist still clung to the cypress leaves and the wind passed low along the ground, they gathered. Bare feet met the chill of polished floorboards, hair tied in tight knots, hands resting softly against the scabbards of unblooded swords. The dojo stood in silence, wide, clean, and breathless. Not merely a room, but a vessel. Its stillness wrapped around the young men like water around stone. Before any sword was touched, there was a ritual. A bow to the kamidana, where paper streamers swayed beneath cedar sprigs. A bow to the master, unmoving as a mountain in snow. A bow to one another, warrior to warrior, equal and unseen. There were no loud instructions, no shouted commands, only breath. Only the slow rhythm of those who had learned that rushing was the death of grace. In the Kamakura way, the sword was never the first lesson. Stillness was, presence, control. Movements flowed like ink on parchment, smooth, deliberate, unbroken. Each step rehearsed 100 times, each gesture drawn from memory older than memory. And when the blade left its sheath, it did not scream. It whispered, a clean sound like wind pulling a silk curtain aside. A good strike did not boast. It arrived, uninvited, without anger. The sword was never used to prove something, only to protect something too sacred to name. Discipline was not only in the hand, it lived in the eyes, soft, focused, unblinking. It lived in the breath, slowed to the beat of the earth itself. The masters would often murmur, "Stillness is sharper than steel," and those who listened understood, because in the stillness came awareness, the flick of a sleeve, the weight of another's silence, the moment when death might come, not with fury, but with calm. Outside, the shogunate rose and ruled. Clans battled beneath banners, names etched into stone. But inside these halls there were no names, only practice, only peace shaped into movement. And when the lesson ended, they bowed again, to gods, to teacher, to each other. Then stepped out into the evening light, their swords silent at their sides, their minds quieter still. But one question lingers, softly, like incense that never fully fades. What became of those who never learned stillness? Those who reached for power before understanding purpose? Many gained much, but few kept it. And so even now, long after those dojos faded into dust, the lesson remains. Power drawn in haste may win a battle, but only restraint can preserve peace. But even in the shadow of death, there was time for quiet. And sometimes, in that quiet, there was tea. The room was small, no more than a few paces wide, its walls made of paper, its floor of woven straw. Outside, wind brushed against the bamboo. Inside, everything was still. A kettle hummed over charcoal. Steam rose slowly, dancing with the morning light. The scent of tatami, aged wood, and roasted matcha mingled in the air, earthy, warm, and calm. Here, warriors came not to speak of war, but to forget it. The tea ceremony, chanoyu, was not performance. It was presence. A guest would bow low at the threshold as if entering another world. His sword was left outside, rank forgotten. In this space there was only the host, the guest, and the moment. Each motion was deliberate. The folding of a cloth, the turning of a bowl, the ladling of hot water, slow and silent. There was a rhythm, but no rush, a precision, but no pride. The samurai had studied many arts, the bow, the sword, the brush, but none required surrender quite like tea, because tea asked for nothing but attention, to the curve of the cup, to the steam against the fingertips, to the sound of water meeting earth. Even in the final hours, before battle, before seppuku, a warrior might drink tea, not as comfort, but as clarity, to taste bitterness on the tongue and not resist, to accept heat and hold it with both hands. There was beauty in this restraint, a final lesson in control. Some said the greatest sword strikes were born in the tea room, where a man first learned to sit with himself. In a world that taught action, the tea room taught stillness. In a culture that prized courage, it reminded one of humility. And in an age of noise, it preserved the sound of silence. And yet, a quiet question lingers in the leaves. What if power had been shaped not by conquest, but by calm? If leaders were taught to pause before acting, to sit, to listen, to serve, perhaps more empires would have risen gently and fallen with grace. Perhaps fewer names would be carved into stone and more into memory. The tea was never just about drinking. It was about slowing down, noticing small things, the shape of a bowl, the way light dances on water, the sound of a single drop falling into silence, to bow before the ordinary, to feel how even steam and breath are part of something sacred, to be reminded that in a world chasing permanence, the fleeting things often matter most. And so, when the last sip was taken, the bowl turned and set down, the warrior would rise. Not hardened, not softened, simply aware. One hand reached for the sword again, but the other still carried the warmth of tea. But it was not the sword alone that shaped a samurai's spirit. There was something softer, a lesson whispered by the wind and carried in petals. In spring, the mountains blushed with bloom. Cherry blossoms, pale as breath, burst open across the ridges and roadsides. Their branches, once bare, now swayed beneath the weight of fleeting beauty. But it never lasted long. Within days, sometimes hours, the petals would fall. One by one, soft and silent. No trumpet marked their passing. No hand tried to catch them, because in that fall was the very meaning of their bloom. To the samurai, this was not tragedy. It was truth. The cherry blossom, sakura, became more than a flower. It became a teacher. A warrior's life, too, could be brief. A single moment might decide it. One breath, drawn or lost, could change a name from living to remembered. And so they studied the sakura, not in books, but with their eyes, with their hearts. Year after year, as boys became men and men faced war, they watched the petals fall, and they listened. To fall without regret was the highest form of grace. The warrior who feared death would grasp, hesitate, falter. But the one who had accepted it, who had trained for it as surely as he had trained to strike, that warrior moved with clarity. Even in battle, a samurai might pause beneath a blooming tree. He would say nothing, but his silence would say everything. It was in that moment, surrounded by beauty that promised to vanish, that he remembered why he carried a sword at all. Not for conquest, not for pride, but to protect what was fleeting, to protect the moment. Sometimes, before riding out to war, a warrior would write a death poem. Sometimes he would sit alone beneath the falling blossoms, drinking tea. And sometimes he would do nothing at all, just watch. Because there are truths that only stillness can reveal. To bloom is a gift, to fall is an honor. Even the shoguns, men of power, of castles and conquest, made time to walk beneath the trees, not to command, but to remember. The petals did not care for rank. They fell on the helmet and the peasant's shoulder the same. And yet, a question floats gently with the drifting blossoms. What if we lived like the sakura, open, unguarded, ready to let go? Would we hold less? Would we feel more? The samurai believed the answer was yes. To live like the blossom was to understand impermanence, to love the fleeting, to honor beauty not because it stays, but because it leaves. Their stories were not carved to last forever. Their names faded, their temples crumbled. But their way still moves in the wind. And when the last petal falls, there is no cry of sorrow, only the hush of the earth and the knowing that something beautiful was here. To die by one's own hand. But some paths did not lead through war. Some led inward, to a final silence few could bear to face. In a small room lit by paper lanterns, the air held its breath, tatami beneath the knees, a blade at rest beside white robes. There was no cry, no chaos, only stillness and the slow unfolding of ritual. This was seppuku, the act of dying by one's own hand, not in madness, not in fear, but in full awareness. It was not a punishment, though it often followed disgrace. Nor was it a protest, though it often spoke louder than words. It was a final bow, a return to honor through one's own resolve. The samurai knelt, his back straight. Before him, a small table with brush, ink, and cup. To the side, a second waited, the kaishakunin, whose duty was mercy. Every gesture mattered. The white robe, a symbol of purity. The final cup of sake, a parting breath. The poem, written with calm hands, the last words of a life lived by the blade. Some dipped the brush slowly, letting the ink settle before writing. Their final words were often simple, brief lines on falling leaves, a passing moon, a body like a robe folded and set aside. Then came the moment. The blade drawn, short, clean, sharpened for this alone. It entered not with rage but with rhythm, a horizontal cut across the belly, the seat of the soul in old belief. Pain was not the point, nor spectacle. It was intent, it was control. And before the pain could seize the spirit, the second's blade would fall, swift and silent, severing the head in a single stroke. Not fully, but just enough to complete the ritual with grace. No shouts, no moaning, only the breath of the living and the silence of the dead. To outsiders, it may seem like madness, but to the samurai, it was clarity, to choose one's death, to end with dignity, not disgrace. This, too, was a kind of freedom. Better to fall by one's own hand, they believed, than to crawl for forgiveness. Better to write the ending, however brief, than to be erased by shame. Even in death, the samurai did not surrender, not to enemies, not to fear, only to the code that shaped them. And yet, a question lingers, quiet and sharp. What kind of world demands such an ending? Where is the weight carried? In the blade? Or in the code behind it? Some say seppuku was a cruel mirror, others a final act of art, the body writing what the soul could not carry further. Either way, it was never taken lightly. It was not death in defeat. It was death as statement, as vow, as the final page of a life bound by duty. And when the room emptied, when the blood was cleaned, only the poem remained, folded carefully, left beside the blade, a bloom of red, a silence of white, a final mark, drawn not in ink, but in will. But there were places where blades were not drawn, where battles were not fought with steel, but with breath. Beyond the castles and blood-soaked fields, past the rice terraces and forest trails, there stood temples, built not of grandeur, but of grace. Wooden beams darkened by rain, stone paths lined with moss, and pines, tall, old, unmoving. These were the homes of monks, and often of samurai. Not all warriors sought battle. Some sought something harder to find, the quiet beyond themselves. They came in the early morning, before the sun reached the floor. They removed their swords at the gate, and entered with nothing but breath. Zazen, seated meditation, was the way. No incense of comfort, no chance for distraction, just the posture, the breath, and the mind, left to sit in its own shadow. The pines whispered above, but said nothing. The birds called, but the monks did not answer. Even the wind seemed to move more gently here. For an hour, or sometimes a day, the samurai would sit. No armor, no orders, no noise, only the ache in the legs, the drift of thought, and the endless return to stillness. It was not peace they sought, not exactly, but presence, to sit without moving, to feel time stretch and vanish, to notice the way a single pine needle falls and the space it makes in the world. In that silence, something softened. A man learned to bow to thought, not chase it, to watch anger rise, then dissolve like mist, to see fear for what it was, passing like the clouds over the mountains. And in that letting go, death itself became lighter, not gone, but no longer a weight. Many who faced death sat here first, and those who returned did so changed, because in the temple no enemy could be blamed, no rank could be worn, and no sword could strike what lived inside. Stillness, the monk said, was the greatest blade. And yet, a question echoes between the trees. What if the true battlefield lies not outside us, but within? How many wars could be quieted, if more chose to sit rather than swing? For in that sitting, the samurai found something rare. Not weakness, but surrender. Not defeat, but clarity. And when the meditation ended, they bowed once more. Not to gods, not to power, but to the moment itself. Then they rose, stepped outside, and though their sword returned to their hip, for a while longer their heart remained beneath the pines. But even before the battle began, the weight had already settled, not on the blade, but on the body. Samurai armor did not merely protect, it carried. Laced in silk cords, lacquered in deep blacks and ochre reeds, the plates shimmered in sunlight like beetle wings. Each piece had a name, each knot had purpose, and every curve remembered someone. To don it was a ritual. The breastplate curved like a shrine gate, the shoulder guards wide as burdens, the helmet heavy as lineage, and beneath it all, the robe white as a shroud. It was not quick, it was not light, but it was never meant to be. For armor did not only shield the body, it whispered of oath. To wear it was to carry the name of one's house, the face of one's ancestors, and the silence of all those who never returned. Some men wore it proudly, others wore it like a prayer. But all knew, when the plates locked into place, they were no longer their own. The weight was not only iron, it was duty, it was memory, it was the shape of a life that had already accepted its end. And so, on the morning of battle, they moved slowly, not from fear, but because each step was a goodbye, to ease, to self, to softness. They tightened every knot, checked every strap, tucked letters into sleeves. Some carried death poems sewn into the lining, and many said nothing at all. They looked once toward the sky, not for victory, but for peace with what would come. Armor could not promise survival, but it could promise meaning. It bore the clan crest, painted bold on the back or helmet, a flower, a wheel, a crane, each symbol reminding the warrior, you are not alone, you are part of something larger, you are already remembered. Even the dents and scratches told stories, some from training, others from fathers, a few from ghosts. The inside of the armor sometimes held scribbles in ink, notes from a mother, a child, a vow. Sweat soaked the cloth padding. Rain softened the lacquer. And yet, a question hums beneath the iron. How many burdens do we choose to carry, simply because they were handed to us? How many armors do we wear, long after the battle is over? The samurai knew the armor was not them, but for a time it had to be. And when the battle ended, win or fall, the armor would be removed as it was worn, slowly, silently, with reverence, laid down not with relief, but with care. For even in rest it was sacred. And though the man might walk again with bare shoulders, the memory of that weight would never fully leave. It lived in posture, in silence, in the way a warrior reached for nothing, unless it truly mattered. But not all battles began in war cries or footsteps. Some began in silence, with cloth, with breath, and a single blade drawn not to kill, but to shine. Before the sun touched the rooftops, before the roosters called, a samurai would rise, not to train, not to eat, but to polish his sword. The room was still dark. Only a single lamp or sliver of morning light marked the hour. But the ritual began the same, with stillness. The blade was unwrapped with care, never rushed. The silk cloth unfolded like a prayer, and the steel, curved, slender, perfect, caught the faint light like water catching moonlight. It was not just maintenance, it was meditation. The cloth moved in its slow circles, oil evenly spread, edge inspected, every smudge removed, not to impress, but to honor. For the sword was not a tool, it was a reflection, not only of the face, but of the soul. Each warrior had one, and only one. Passed down or forged by commission, its edge carried memory, of hands, of battles, of silence. Some bore notches from past strikes, some had none at all, their sharpness tested only on straw or air. But each was cared for the same, because readiness was not the absence of fear, it was the presence of respect. To polish the blade was to vow, I will meet what comes with clarity, not with rage, not with hesitation, but with eyes open. Even if the sword was never drawn, the ritual remained, every morning, every day. Not because danger was near, but because one should never wait for danger to become awake. Some spoke softly to their blades, not superstition, but companionship. The same way a monk might speak to a bell, or a farmer to the soil. Some remembered names etched faintly into the tang. Ancestors, makers, myths. Others left offerings beside them, a strip of paper, a sprig of pine, a folded line of poetry. It was not show, it was a bond. And yet, a thought rises with the morning steam. What if we too tended to our lives like this, wiping each moment clean, sharpening our awareness, holding what we carry not with pride, but with presence? The samurai knew the blade could not lie. A dull edge revealed neglect. A rusted spine revealed forgetting. So they remembered. Every morning, even when peace was certain, even when hands ached, even when no battle waited. Because polishing the sword was not about the fight. It was about being ready to walk through it without shaking. And when the cloth was folded again, and the blade returned to its sheath, the samurai did not boast. He did not speak. He simply stood, straight, still, prepared, not for victory, but for whatever waited. And outside, the light crept slowly across the floor, touching the blade, the breath, and the silence that followed. But not all farewells were spoken aloud. Some were folded quietly in the dark and left behind. In the dim light of the watchtower or the hush of a travel inn, a samurai would sit, brush in hand, parchment before him. The night before battle, the hours before fate. No armor, no helmet, only words. Some wrote to their wives, their children, their aging parents. Others addressed no one at all, only the moment. But always it was quiet, ink mixed with breath, hands steady but heavy. The weight was not the brush, it was what had not yet been said. They wrote of small things, a warm bowl of rice, a daughter's laugh, the sound of wind chimes in summer, the softness of a robe folded neatly at home. Things that, if not spoken now, might vanish forever. Some recalled childhood, chasing fireflies in the field, or the scent of wet earth after rain. Some asked questions they would never hear answered. The paper was thin, the strokes deliberate, sometimes smudged by a fingertip, or a tear quickly brushed aside. No flourish, no title, just honesty. Some letters were folded and tucked into sleeves or under armor. Some were sealed with a string, left with a friend, or placed inside a lacquered box. And many were never meant to be delivered. Because to write was not always to send. It was to release, to speak in stillness what pride could not say aloud. I am afraid. I am ready. Forgive me. I remember the way you looked that morning when I left. And sometimes simply, I loved you more than I could show. No ceremony marked the writing, only the lamp burning low, the night creeping toward dawn, and a warrior choosing his last words, just in case. Some added a pressed flower, some a scrap of silk from a child's sash. These were not gifts, they were anchors, small weights to carry memory forward. And yet, a question lingers in the ink. What becomes of the words we never send? Do they fade with time? Or do they wait, folded inside memory, like blades kept sheathed in silence? The samurai believed that truth spoken, even privately, left a mark. Even if no one read the letter, it had been written. And that sometimes was enough, because the act of writing was not for the world. It was for the soul, a kind of letting go. And so the letter was folded, pressed smooth, tucked away. And when the battle came, whether death followed or not, the words remained, waiting in sleeves, resting in boxes, sleeping inside drawers long after the hand that wrote them was gone. No monument bore them, no record listed their names. But they were there, ink and silence, folded inside history. They did not win wars, they did not change the world, but they revealed it, in a single line, a single moment, when a warrior allowed himself to feel. Not all partings came with screams or sorrow. Some came gently, with a single bell and the hush that followed. High in the hills where pine trees leaned like watchful elders, temples stood where sound was rare and silence was sacred. Stone steps worn smooth by sandals, lanterns swaying in the wind. And at the heart of it all, a bell suspended in stillness. It did not ring often, but when it did, the valley listened. The monk approached barefoot, his robe brushing against gravel. He bowed once, then lifted the rope. The first strike was not loud, but deep. It rolled outward like thunder buried in silk, a sound not of alarm but of remembrance. Once, then silence, then again, slow, deliberate, full of space. And with each strike, something passed, not the soul itself, but the memory of it. The bell did not cry out in grief. It held grief, carried it like water in a smooth, unbroken bowl. Farmers paused in their fields. Old women looked up from their gardens. Travelers stopped on the road, unsure why tears had come. Because the bell was not for one man alone. It was for all who had ever loved, ever lost, ever listened. When a samurai died, whether by blade, by age, or by choice, the temple bell would toll, not to mourn a warrior, but to mark a passage, to say, he was here, he is gone, and we remember. It echoed through fog, bounced softly between trees, and faded, like breath on a winter window. Some temples rang the bell 49 times. Once for each day, the soul was said to journey through the in-between. Others rang it just once, and let that single note carry everything. Even the birds paused, even the wind waited. It was not silence that followed, it was reverence. Children who grew up near the temple learned early what the sound meant. They didn't ask who had died. They simply bowed and whispered the same word the monks did, "Go well." And yet, a quiet question lingers in the air. What if remembrance didn't need names? What if the most sacred grief came not from saying more, but from saying less? The monks believed the bell was not sound, it was space, a way to hold death without turning from it, to shape mourning not into wailing, but into stillness. Because not every goodbye is loud. Some arrive wrapped in morning mist and leave only an echo. And when the ringing stopped, the world did not rush to fill the silence. It waited, as if listening for what came after loss, not answers, but presence, a knowing, a breath, a bow toward the hills. Some say the bell still rings, even when no hand touches the rope, that it holds the names of those long forgotten, and speaks for them still. Some began long before the blade was drawn, in the quiet, in the dark, within. The night before battle was not loud, it was still, the campfires low, voices hushed. Even the wind passed softly through the pines, as if not to disturb the thoughts unfolding in silence. Some warriors prayed, some sharpened their blades, but some simply sat. Away from tents and torches, knees folded beneath them, palms resting on thighs, alone beneath the stars. There, without armor or title, a warrior met the only enemy he could not outrun, himself. No orders to follow, no opponent to read, only the self, with all its doubts, its memories, its buried fears rising like mist. The stillness offered no comfort, only truth. Faces returned, a father's silence, a friend's dying breath, the blood left on hands long since washed. Questions arrived uninvited. Am I ready? Will I return? What did I leave unsaid? And still, he sat. Because to rise with purpose tomorrow, he must first sit with all that weighed on him tonight. This was not weakness, it was cleansing. A silent rite passed between generations. No scroll taught it, no teacher named it. But all who had seen war knew its shadow. The samurai did not seek to destroy fear, only to witness it and bow. Sometimes he would breathe slowly, matching the rhythm of the trees swaying above. Sometimes he would weep, and sometimes, more often than one might think, he would smile. Not from joy, but from understanding, that even fear could be carried with grace, that even sorrow could become a companion. He remembered laughter once shared, meals left unfinished, the warmth of hands no longer near. He remembered the words he wished he had spoken, and he forgave himself, not with ease, but with honesty. The earth beneath him did not judge. The sky did not rush him. They simply stayed, still, open, listening. And yet, a question settled with the dew. What if true courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to meet it with open eyes? The warrior knew, swords may clash tomorrow, but tonight the greater battle was within. To accept one's flaws, to make peace with one's past, to step into fate, not as a symbol, but as a soul. And so he sat, unmoving, not waiting for clarity, but allowing it. The moon passed overhead. The night deepened, and in that darkness he became something stiller than stone, quieter than breath. When he finally rose, there was no triumph, only readiness. No armor could protect like this kind of knowing. No blade could cut deeper than the self already seen. The fire crackled nearby, dawn still a few hours away, but within him the light had already begun to rise. Some journeys were not measured in miles. They were measured in silence, in breath, in the prints that vanished behind. The road was white, not blank, but quiet. Snow fell without sound, layering the world in stillness, and through it walked the samurai, cloak drawn close, straw sandals wrapped tight, each step pressed into the earth, then softened almost as soon as it was made. He did not speak, neither did those beside him. The snow absorbed all sound, even the creak of armor, the rhythm of footfalls, the murmur of thoughts not yet spoken. There was no need for words. This was not a march of conquest. It was a walk of awareness. Every step a meditation, every breath a question. Will I return? Will my name remain? Will this path be remembered? But the snow answered gently, no name stays, no path lasts, and that too is sacred. The warrior looked ahead, but also around. The trees bowed slightly under the weight of the snow. A fox darted between shadows. A crow cried once from the distance, then vanished. Even the sky felt close, not above, but beside him, as if the heavens themselves walked too, silent and watchful. And so he walked, not faster, not slower, just present. He knew the snow would erase his footprints, that the wind would sweep the path clean, but still he stepped forward, because the point was never to be remembered by the earth, but to be remembered by the moment. He remembered the warmth of his home, the sound of laughter near a hearth, the smell of broth carried in winter air. These were not distractions, they were reasons. And yet, a thought passed as lightly as the breeze. What if every step, though forgotten by the world, is remembered by the soul that took it? The samurai carried no illusion of permanence. His blade would dull, his name would fade. Even the crests on his armor would crack with time. But in that snow-covered silence, he touched something timeless. The beauty of moving forward without needing to be seen. The grace of vanishing with dignity. The peace of knowing that even footsteps made in silence still mattered. He walked not to be known, but to be whole. And as he walked on, his trail slowly disappeared behind him. Not lost, but let go. But the fiercest warriors were not always fearless. They simply learned to hide the parts of themselves the world could not carry. Before battle, the samurai fastened the menpo, the iron mask. It covered the lower half of the face, jaw, mouth, emotion. It was carved with snarls, sneers, or frozen calm, designed not to reflect the man beneath, but to protect him. Because war did not welcome grief. It did not allow trembling hands or trembling lips, and so the mask held what could not be shown. Behind the steel, there were men who mourned, men who feared, men who, just hours before, had written to their children or whispered a name they dared not speak aloud. The mask did not erase those truths. It simply concealed them. To the enemy, it showed resolve. To one's own comrades, it showed strength. But to the warrior himself, it was a shield, not from arrows, but from exposure. Because to survive the battlefield, one had to become unreadable, not cruel, not inhuman, but still unreadable. And yet, in the still moments before the clash, the mask could feel heavier than the sword. It pressed not only on the face, but on the breath. It trapped warmth. It held in the last exhale of peace. Some warriors carved their masks to resemble demons. Others chose calm, expressionless forms. But always, always, the eyes remained bare, because no mask could hide what the eyes still remembered. Loss, longing, moments frozen in memory, never spoken aloud, and sometimes, even mid-battle, the eyes would close for half a second, not from fatigue, but from something remembered, a promise, a voice, a face left behind. Sometimes, in the quiet after battle, a samurai would remove his mask slowly, not as habit, as ceremony. What it held in was released again. The weight of decisions, the sorrow of loss, the sheer ache of being alive. No crowds watched, no songs were sung, but the moment mattered more than any victory. And yet, a question lingers beneath the lacquer. What does it cost a man to hide himself too well? And when the battle ends, does he remember how to take the mask off? The samurai knew the face could lie, the blade could deceive, but the heart, if not honored, would grow silent. And so some warriors prayed not only for victory, but for return. Not to home, but to themselves, to be able to feel again, to speak again, to cry without steel between breath and skin. Because it was not just courage that marched into battle, it was love, regret, hope, all tucked behind a curve of iron. And when the mask was laid down beside the sword, it did not clang, it rested, as if the heart it hid was still learning how to be seen. And sometimes, when no one was watching, a warrior would lift the mask to the sky, whisper a name, and let the wind carry what words could not. But not all shrines were built to honor gods. Some were built to face ghosts, not with fear, but with reverence. In the forest, where moss wrapped around stone and light filtered through cedar trees, a shrine stood. It was small, no grand torii gate, no offerings piled high. Just a few weathered stones, a carved figure half worn by rain, and the hush of wind passing through bamboo. It had no name, but those who found it knew it had been built by someone who had taken more than he could forget. Some warriors, after their battles were done, turned away from the blade and toward prayer, not to erase what they had done, but to sit beside it, to bow to it. This shrine, they say, was raised by a man who once killed without pause, who rose through ranks, who returned victorious, but never whole. Years later he came to this clearing, not as a samurai, not as a monk, but as someone who could no longer carry the silence alone. Stone by stone he built it, each one placed with trembling hands, not to be seen, but to be understood. For the fallen had names, and he had remembered them. He whispered them as he worked, lit incense with eyes closed, laid offerings not of gold or food, but of folded paper, strands of thread, old poems written on torn silk. Each one a memory, each one a weight released. This was not penance, it was recognition. Because regret is not the wound. It is what grows when the wound is never named. And yet, a question lingers beneath the roots. Can prayer reach the past? Can hands that once held death now build something sacred? The monks say yes, but only if the building is slow, only if it is quiet, only if it is honest. So he returned each season. In winter, he cleared snow from the steps. In spring, he tied fresh strings of paper to the branches. In summer, he swept the path free of leaves. And in autumn, he lit the fire, not for warmth, but for remembrance. He brought small things, a child's toy, a dried persimmon, a scrap of cloth with the scent of incense still lingering. None of them valuable, except in memory. He asked for nothing. He sought no forgiveness. He simply bowed, and when he left slowly, as if the forest itself had been listening, as if the earth had taken his burdens and folded them into its roots. Because sometimes peace is not the absence of pain, but the presence of care. And the shrine still stands, they say, half swallowed by the earth, but never forgotten. A monument not to glory, but to the quiet grace of looking back. A place where silence speaks and the past is honored, not rewritten, but gently held. But some spirits do not fade with time. They walk beside us still, silent, steady, unseen. In the alleyways of Kyoto, where vending machines hum beside old shrines, a salaryman bows to an elder. The rain falls softly, tapping rooftops like fingers on a drum. Umbrellas open, shoes splash. But beneath it all, something older moves. A man returns from work late, coat soaked, spine straight. He says little. He carries everything, not a sword, not armor, but duty. In the flick of a broom outside a family shop. In the care taken to place sandals by the door. In the way a train conductor greets the empty air with a bow, as if ancestors are watching. Bushido did not vanish. It faded inward. It folded itself into gestures, into choices, into silence. Some say it lives in the way a chef sharpens his knife each morning, as if preparing for war. Not against an enemy, but against carelessness. Others feel it in the dojo, where students bow before an empty space, not to worship, but to remember. You find it in the pause before entering a room, the quiet refusal to cut corners, the soft pride taken in unseen effort. There is no battlefield now, no siege, no banner in the wind. And yet, a question moves beneath the umbrellas. What becomes of a code when the world it was written for is gone? Does it die, or does it change its shape? A woman kneels to clean her ancestor's grave. A child watches his grandfather write a single kanji in calligraphy, with more focus than most give a lifetime. A craftsman remakes a single wooden comb until it is perfect, and then gives it away. In these gestures, legacy breathes. These are not acts of combat, but they are not soft, they are precise, they are present, they are echoes. Even now, in a country of neon and bullet trains, there are those who walk headfirst into the storm, not because they seek pain, but because they refuse to step aside. And the rain does not part for them, but it recognizes them. Because in that quiet resolve, that willingness to bear the weight of one's role without applause, Bushido breathes, not as a law, but as a posture, a rhythm, a vow carried silently through the noise. It is not written on scrolls, it is lived in posture, in restraint, in the grace of a bow given even when no one sees. And when the rain lifts and the sky begins to clear, no words are spoken. But somewhere, an old warrior would nod, not because the path was easy, but because it was walked with care. But all things sacred are fleeting, and so it is with story, not ended, but returned to silence. The scrolls have been read, not all, just enough. What remains unsaid is not forgotten. It waits in the rustle of robes, the scent of pine, the spaces where speech once stood. For every warrior you met, every ritual described, every silence honored, was not given for admiration. It was given for reflection. They lived not to be remembered, but to remind us that dignity is not loud, that restraint is its own form of strength, that honor, once broken, cannot be reclaimed with fury, only with stillness. In their time, blades were drawn, not always rightly, not always cleanly, and yet many died asking the same question. Did I serve what was true? This is the weight they leave us, not in the stories themselves, but in what we do when the story ends. To choose patience, to offer care where haste once lived, to sharpen our words less often, and our awareness more. Bushido was never only about the sword, it was about how one stood when no one watched, how one walked through the world, upright, present, prepared to face the cost of one's choices. And so, as the fire dims, the question is not what you remember, it is what you carry forward. Will you bow before the unnoticed? Will you choose silence when noise is easy? Will you protect what is fragile, even if it does not belong to you? This is how the past lives on, not through statues, but through conduct, through ritual, through unseen choices made with care. The bell does not ring to end the tale, it rings to return the world to itself, softened, stilled, more awake. So now we rise, slowly, not to leave, but to walk differently. And somewhere, deep in the folds of mist, an old warrior bows, not to be seen, but because it is right. The scroll closes now, its edges worn, but its voice unshaken. Though the ink fades, what it carried lingers, not in words alone, but in the quiet between them. Tonight's story was never meant to teach, only to remind and to return. So let it echo softly, long after this moment has passed. Rest easy now, traveler. The past will keep watch, and the silence will do the rest.